So mahalo nui. Thank you so much. So the first speaker and presenter I'd like to bring up is Kumujan Osorio. Kumujan, if you could turn your camera on now or begin sharing screen, now would be the perfect time. Perfect. And so Jonathan K. Kamakavivo Ole Osorio is Dean of Hawai'i Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge. Dr. Osorio received his PhD in history from the University of Hawaii. At Kamakakua Kalani, he has developed and taught classes in history, literature, laws, culture, music as historical texts, and research methodologies for and from Indigenous peoples. His recent publications include The Value of Hawaii, Knowing from the Past and Shaping the Future, which he co-edited and authored, and Dismembering Lahui, A History of Hawaiian Nation to 1887. He is also a composer and singer and has been a Hawaiian music recording artist since 1975. Kumujan, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Mahalo, Hilani, and mahalo to Benedict and the others who have organized the symposium. I'm really happy to participate. I'm going to say that the much of the information that I'm sharing are things that have been pointed out to me by other people and other scholars. And I want to talk a little bit about, before I actually get into the discussion of the kingdom itself, speak a little bit about what actually happens in the territory once the U.S. Takes control of Hawaii and territorializes Hawaii. We don't use the word, Hawaiians generally don't use the word annexation because we are completely aware that the United States has never actually passed a treaty of annexation with the Hawaiian Kingdom or the Hawaiian Republic or any other kind of entity related to Hawaiians. Most of this information comes from a 2014 MA thesis written by Carrie Ilima Long. She was a graduate of our program. She's currently a PhD student here at UH Manoa, but she also works for, she actually now works for labor unions. And in her 2014 thesis entitled Unfit for Queen, Mo'oku'auhau National Consciousness and Eugenics in Territorial Hawaii, she begins by really describing what the foundation of Hawaiian identity is, and really nests it very significantly in Mo'oku'auhau, or genealogy. This is something that we understand links us not only to the 1,000 generations, the hundreds of generations of Hawaiians who have resided in Hawaii from earliest settlement on, but really to more than 800 generations of people going back across the Pacific. We have this very long sense of ourselves that's nested in this knowledge of who our ancestors were, what their names were, who their children were. And this is actually what is the formulation of our sense of being. For Kanaka Oiwi, Kanaka Maoli, that ancestry, along with our residence on this aina, the Pai Aina o Hawaii, these islands here are what actually defines who we are, gives us our sense of values, our sense of place in the universe, our dignity, and that these things were very actively challenged and in many cases erased by the coming of white foreigners beginning at the end of the 18th century, and then a number of migrations of whites into our lands, into our nation, into our kingdom, that ultimately result in the takeover of this country by a small group of mostly American businessmen who were also citizens of this country and participated in government. But they conspired to take control of the country, and then they turned it over to the United States. in her thesis, having pointed out the immense power and um, mana, strength that we get from Mo'oku Auhau, um, Ilima describes how the territorial government and the educational program worked essentially to desecrate this notion of Mo'oku Auhau by pointing out continuously that the Hawaiians of the early 20th century were nothing like their forebears, who were strong and powerful and smart and wise and resourceful and brave. No, we were the descendants of people who did not survive the coming of foreigners. We did not survive our own internal wars. We did not survive um, the introduction of diseases. We did not survive the coming of Asiatics, of Chinese and later Japanese laborers who were brought over for the sugar company, for the sugar industry to be cheap labor. That those of us who were remnants really were from a much weaker strain of what were originally Hawaiians. This kind of education, which was placed into institutions like Kamehameha schools in the second decade of the 20th century, actually became, part of the curriculum for today what would be middle schoolers, teaching them really that they were but a shadow of what their forebears were, was an important eugenics kind of argument for why a student at Kamehameha, all of whom were Native Hawaiian, all of whom were Kanaka Maoli, why they should embrace American education that would teach them to be stronger, self-sufficient, hardworking, self-sacrificing, saving our money, so that we could purchase our own land, our own homes, so that we could stand up on our own 2 feet, like our ancestors once had done, but where we were no longer capable. In addition to this kind of operation, the territory was also, at that same moment, looking at legislation to sterilize people who were considered unfit, the feeble-minded, the alcoholic, the lazy eventually, those people who had demonstrated an inability to care for themselves, according to, early 20th century American standards. Waimano Home, which was established as a care facility for people who, just were seen as incredibly vulnerable, also became a site where sterilization could be conceived as a good for the society. And one of the really important kinds of statements that were being made at this time was that the unfit, and that was the general term used for them, that the unfit were a burden on society and would keep the society from prospering as it should, from becoming everything that it should be. Therefore, it was a mercy not to punish them necessarily, or not to incarcerate them, but to prevent them from procreating through mandatory sterilization. That legislation did not pass, even though it was introduced twice, I think in 2013 and 2014. I'm sorry, 1913 and 1914. But the way people voted in that, she points out, basically Caucasians voted yes, Hawaiian legislators voted no. I want to take this, and I guess I'm running out of time here. The Kingdom of Hawaii and the earlier society, which originally welcomed people from other countries, and especially Westerners, Hawai'i, Americans, Europeans, and incorporated them into our society, always operated under an overwhelming and overweening kind of discourse that Hawaiians needed, that our people needed to change. We needed to be different than we were, or that we would not survive. Missionaries who came in 1820 said that we were sinful, that our habits, our customs, our sexuality, all of these were abominations to God, and that's why we were dying. Later, people who arrived in the 1840s and 1850s, close to these missionaries and also very much supporters of the American mission, began to make a different argument, that we were dying because we were not self-reliant, because we were weak, because we wouldn't labor, because we wouldn't work for 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day and save our money. Men like William Little Lee argued that it was only the brawny hand of labor that would save Hawaiians. It wouldn't be God, it would be labor. And so much of what defined what they defined as what was good for the society was based essentially on capitalist values of working hard, earning money, being able to exist as a consumer, being able to produce as a laborer. Chinese were brought to work on labor plantations because they were cheaper, and yet at some point, the primarily white business people and bankers and plantation owners found fault with that labor because they felt that they were actually a threat to white businesses and white concerns as they left the plantation. And so they argued that such people were actually fouling Hawaiian society by marrying into Hawaiian families and mixing the races. I'm going to finish by simply saying that the eugenics arguments in Hawaii were never very, very far from arguments about how capitalist work ethics, productivity, consumerism had to be paramount. Those were the really huge changes to our society. Those were the things that destabilized our people. As much as the disease, this notion that our worth and our value as a people could only really be measured by how much we earned and the value of our property, and whether we could, whether we could compete along with other people for that kind of material prosperity. And that continues to be a problem for all of us. Thank you.
Mahalo Kumujan, especially for bringing into the conversation that eugenics is not just a biological process, but a social, political, and an economic one as well. Something that you mentioned was the master's thesis of Carrie Kamako Ka'ilima Long, excuse me. If folks would like to view their master's thesis, I'll put it in the chat for everyone. Yeah, it's public access, so please feel free to check that out. Now I'd like to welcome to the screen Rebecca Stotzer. Rebecca Stotzer is the department chair and professor in the UH Manoa Thompson School of Social Work and Public Health, Department of Social Work. Her work has focused on marginalization in the form of prejudice-motivated violence against marginalized communities, including the ways that social services have historically been used to both assist people, but also to advance the agendas of those in power. Her recent work examines women in extremist movements, social services in territorial Hawaii as contributors to the colonial process, and social work labor force issues. All right, Rebecca, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. I am a little under the weather, so I apologize for my creaky voice, but I'm very excited to be here and learn from everybody. And thank you, Dr. Osorio, for getting us started. I'm going to be talking about the creation of the Waimano Home for the Feeble-Minded, which has already been mentioned. And there's going to be a lot of historical terms that you'll see on the slides, and I am a slide nerd, so I have some quotations as well as some statistics. I know it's not in presenter mode, but this computer does not like presenter mode. I apologize. But I wanted to examine the creation of the Waimano Home for the Feeble-Minded in 1919, using a critical disability lens, but particularly applying it to this colonial space. And so again, there are going to be some historical terms we don't use anymore, like defective, like feeble-minded. So I apologize for people of the early 20th century. But I want to take you to the moment of the special legislative session of 1919. The special session was dealing with many different things, but one of the things they were considering was the creation of the Waimano Home for the Feeble-Minded. And in that session, two groups, the Commission to Investigate Feeble-Mindedness in the Territory of Hawaii and the Central Committee on Child Welfare, presented evidence to the legislators that there was a need for a home for youth with developmental or intellectual disabilities in their communities. However, they did not just sort of get up there and present some facts and data. They staged an entire spectacle at the legislative session, first presenting the data gathered from local community agencies, but then actually reading aloud the names of each individual who had been identified as possibly having some kind of mental delay or disability. As described by Mary Caton, a pioneer of medical social work in the 20th century, as Dr. Andrews, who was the head of the commission, read aloud the names from the collected lists, some legislators would remark, "I know that boy or girl, sure, yeah, he or she is Lolo." And so it was this sort of participatory practice to get the legislators involved in the data itself. And then she also, Caton also describes how, as a part of the spectacle, the CCCW had organized a group of children and brought them to the session. And again, they brought a number of low-grade feeble-minded persons, again, apologies, to a meeting of the Special Legislative Committee. One of these people, who was 23, sat on the floor and played with his toes, reciting the nursery jingle, "This little piggy went to market, this little piggy stayed home." And that was enough to bring success to the sustained efforts of these crusaders. So at first blush, this may seem like sort of a typical progressive era activism, with white elites determining a social need and trying to address it with what they considered as best practice at the time. However, when examining this spectacle with a critical disability lens and keeping in mind the colonial context, a different and complementary purpose appears. This historical moment at the territorial legislature in 19 illuminates the intersection of colonial forces with eugenic thinking in Hawaii, and the ways that crafting a clearly identifiable feeble-minded class in Hawaii created room in the abled imaginary to include the other racial or ethnic minorities who otherwise were already considered defective. This analysis demonstrates how the spectacle, rather than actually trying to define who was feeble-minded and perhaps in need of assistance, was actually an attempt to legislate the normal, as described by Steffens and Creel, anyone know how to say that last name? By legally marking those who are identifiably defective, the ruling colonial elites could position others who were already in suspect classes of the territory closer to the ideas of normal and abled held by those in the continental US. While statehood was never a guarantee, as a next step in the further colonization of Hawaii, being able to expand the abled imaginary to include those who were more contemporarily considered defective or disabled, made room to consider the population of Hawaii as approaching normal when thinking about the territory's fate in the future. So who is normal, right, is a big question. When you're using a critical disability lens, particularly in colonized spaces, the critical disability encourages us to think about the ways that we socially disable people, that disability is not something inherent to the body. It's something that is created, manufactured, and sustained by societies. In addition to trying to define who is disabled, as a project of our society, inevitably, this also means that there's a mutual grappling with who is abled in a society. So for example, Campbell wrote that an abled imaginary relies upon the existence of a hitherto unacknowledged, imagined, shared community of able bodies and minded people held together by a common ableist homosocial worldview that asserts the preferability and compulsoriness of the norms of ableism. So defining who is disabled requires clarification of those who are deemed both abled and by extension normal, right? So similarly, when we're examining colonial spaces in the US, especially those that we were occupying, and so many of which we continue to occupy at this time, there was a deep identity crisis and a concern for what constituted normal. Particularly in the sense of an emerging American identity. Americans were not bound by blood or lineage, and the US had the unique task of determining who is us and who is them as a nation that was constantly in flux due to immigration, ongoing genocide of Native peoples, shifts in land and political power over the land due to colonial expansion, and a shift from a more rural economy to one that was increasingly more industrial. The creation of the racial category white was one such way to manufacture a shared identity for many who had been in the United States and who held power, but it was deeply tied to class, to being a true American, and to emerging ideas of normalcy. But when white became a marker of American identity, it creates a space for other racial or ethnic groups to be considered less than. The desire to define normalcy through race came in many forms, but most relevant to this conversation is the form of eugenic pseudoscientists trying to create racial hierarchies. When whiteness was tied to being normal, all other racial, ethnic, or cultural groups inherently became something other than normal, right? So we've seen in the work of Dolmage and others the ways that that the U.S. used immigration as a way to control suspect classes who at first were presumed to have higher than normal rates of disability, but then over time became synonymous with disability. And so then we passed immigration laws as one way to try to mitigate the influx of defective classes. But when the US was having its colonial ambitions and expanding beyond the sort of geographical borders of the continental US, this arose, like a problem arose, right? Because all of a sudden the colonial spaces, which were predominantly non-white, were being brought into the body of America. So those concerns around the annexation debates, and as Dr. Osorio mentioned, we can absolutely argue the term annexation, but that's what was searchable in the newspapers at the time. These are two newspaper articles that expressed people's concerns about the admission or the welcoming of Hawaii into America. So simply because they knew that people would be upset because they knew that people would be appalled at the thought of giving statehood to the mongrel populations of these islands, most of them pagans and incapable of appreciating our civilization and our institutions, right? So this presumption of defect was inherent in the annexation debates at the turn of the century. And so again, when we use this context to try to think through who is unfit or who is defective, and what is the purpose of defining defect if your entire population is already presumed defective, right? Sort of what purposes might that serve beyond just sort of a social service goal? And so the road to the Waimano home took a few steps. So eugenics thinking was present in Hawaii newspapers since the early 1900s. There's evidence of eugenic marriage and eugenic lectures and things like that. The first law to promote the sterilization of defectives was in 1913, as Dr. Osorio mentioned. It was actually brought up subsequently about every 20 years for the next 6 to 8 decades, actually. And a formal eugenics curriculum was added to Kamehameha schools in 1913. The Central Committee on Child Welfare, which was essentially a bunch of well-to-do, predominantly white women, was formed in 1914. And they had a variety of issues that they wanted to look at, including juvenile justice, protecting sexually vulnerable young men and women, developing social services. They created nutrition programs in schools, but one of their early actions was the creation and the fight for Waimano home. And then the legislature actually created the commission to investigate in 1918. So the research was actually essentially a broad ask from individuals as well as various social service organizations to collect a list of names of people suspected to be feeble-minded. This was based entirely on people's impressions. They found 336 people, or 336 made it onto the list, and it was dominated by Oahu, but was split almost evenly between males and females. So the purpose of the spectacle, like why did they have this spectacle? Instead of just reporting the results, why did they read the list of names, right? Like why did they get the group of youth to come and sort of perform in a way for the legislature. So if you look at the value of specimens showcased in freak shows back in the day, their value depends on their peculiarity, right? So how are they different from others? And that each cultural moment has its own ideals for the body that are illustrated through its portrayal of difference, but odd bodies are also defined by and carry implications for other ideological debates like social class and gender. So when you look at the people who ended up in the survey, the percent of those racial or ethnic groups in the population and who ended up in the first year of the Waimano home, you can see that there's a racialized project going on in terms of determining who is normal and who may be actually eligible for normalcy. We see the disproportionate inclusion of Hawaiians who also were, if you remember the list of organizations who were surveyed, so the Kalihi Orphanage, Kapilani Girls Home, they were also disproportionately likely to be in those homes due to other social factors. And then some groups like Japanese, who one might argue were the furthest from being considered normal, were the less likely to be disproportionately represented as overrepresented, but they were actually underrepresented. So what was the purpose of the spectacle, right? The purpose was not to create a high functioning institutional environment for children with high levels of need due to disability, but it was actually to create a line that divided those who were truly defective from those who were in suspect classes in the territory and presumed to be defective. And so this analysis, although rushed, highlights the way that laws as well as sort of social convention can be used against already marginalized communities, right? By disabling and like statutorily defining who is a disabled portion of the community, it gave that potential in the abled imaginary to consider the rest of the population as able-bodied and normal, but then further marginalized this group of people. And it was, again, sort of racial or ethnically targeted in ways that needs further exploration. I could totally go on about this forever, but I want to honor the next person and I will stop. But I'm excited about questions at the end. So thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. That was truly fascinating, especially hearing what you talked about with Waimano Home and even just the political theater in the legislature, creating just a social process to identify who is able to exist in our society and who gets left out. That being said, I'm going to bring up our next presenter, Christine Manganaro. If you're able to, please turn on your camera and we can get ready for the next presenter. All right, Christine Manganaro is a historian specializing in the history of the human sciences in the United States, and especially of scientific and popular conceptions of race and heredity in 20th century America. She has a PhD in history of medicine and the biological sciences from the University of Minnesota. An independent scholar transitioning into policy research, Manganaro was an associate professor of history at the Maryland Institute College of Art from 2012 to 2013, and served as associate dean of liberal arts from 2018 to 2022. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Benedict and my fellow panelists before I get started, some of whom have published work that's been really formative for me. So it's a distinct thrill to be on this panel with them. I'm in Baltimore City on the unceded lands of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples and the current home of the Piscataway, Lumbee, and Eastern Band of Cherokee. And what I'm going to talk about tonight for me is predictions that became commonplace in the early 20th century, that a new race of people was on its way to forming in Hawaii. So the first slide I'm showing you is a page from the Westminster Review published in April of 1911. And this is just a visual aid for work that was done by Liddell Kelly. The Westminster Review was a radical journal founded in England by Jeremy Bentham in the early 1820s. And what's notable about this piece is that this is the first example in the lay literature that I found of predictions that a new race was being formed in Hawaii. You can see here on this slide that there's a description of a process of fusion happening, and that there's a coming Pacific race. Okay, I may come back to that. The next example that I have, I'll describe. This is a page from Mid-Pacific magazine in 1926. And this is one of the first pieces published by Romanzo Adams, who many of you are probably familiar with, who was for a very long time a professor of anthropology and sociology at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. And this uses the language of a racial melting pot. The term melting pot was coined by Israel Zangwill, who wrote the script for the play The Melting Pot in 1909. And following the production of that play, which popularized the term, a number of additional articles appeared in lay publications that identified Hawaii's population as undergoing racial and cultural fusion. Let's see. I'll keep going there. So Adams and his colleagues at the University of Hawaii made projections using what they thought of as science to predict racial fusion in Hawaii. Adams published a book that is still cited for its demographic data called Interracial Marriage in Hawaii. Excuse me, and told the story of Hawaii actually as a natural history of racial contact and mixing. A narrative that downplayed the colonization of Hawaii and instead framed the island as becoming increasingly American while lacking the race relation problems of the continent. It also publicized the idea that so-called pure or so-called full-blooded Kanaka Maoli were disappearing, while part Hawaiians, I'm making the quotation marks there, or quote, mixed bloods, were increasing and contributing toward an emerging, thoroughly hybridized people. I'm moving quickly through this literature because I only have a few minutes, but the same year that Adams published Interracial Marriage in Hawaii, which had been about a 15-year project for him, Sidney Gulick published a book called Mixing the Races in Hawaii, and the subtitle here is key, a study of the coming Neo-Hawaiian American race. Sidney Gulick, a missionary to Japan who served on the boards of the American Board of Foreign Missions and the Institute of Social and Religious Research in New York, published this book for a general audience, for a public audience. And in this book, he argued emphatically for the eventuality of this Neo-Hawaiian American type. And he drew heavily on Adams and his colleagues' work at the University of Hawaii to make his case. What I want to do for a moment is highlight the bottom of this first page here and read to you the entirety of this excerpt. The description of this slide is the cover page and first page of this book, Mixing the Races in Hawaii. Gulick says, to the writer, more interesting and significant than any characterizations is the fact that in Hawaii, a remarkable synthesis of the most diverse races is going forward. Here, a Hawaiian, Caucasian, Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, Puerto Rican, Korean, Filipino race of enthusiastic Americans is in process of becoming. Hawaii is in truth a gentle melting pot that is actually fusing, that is actually fusing into one of the most diverse of human bloods. For hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps millions, the human race has been undergoing, through more or less rigid segregation, a process of divergent evolution, biological, psychological, and sociological. Now, here in Hawaii, the process is in reverse. Rigid segregation is no more. Intimate relations and contacts take its place. A homogeneous people speaking a single language is coming into being under the most favorable conditions. A polyglot population of many races, each racial group possessed of its own marked mental, social, moral, and spiritual traditions and customs mutually and profoundly different, is being transformed into a united people. Here, under circumstances which can be accurately observed, is taking place the fact of race genesis. Sorry, that was Gulick. All right, moving right along here. Samuel Wilder King in 1939 wrote a piece called Hawaii Has No Race Problem, which was published in the magazine Asia in March of 1939. So this is just a couple of years after Adams and Gulick published their books. Samuel Wilder King, at the time of writing of this article, was a member of the Hawaii Statehood Commission. And I mention this by way of making the argument that what we see here is actually an argument for it being a good idea for Hawaii to become a state. Samuel Wilder King, and you can see here an excerpt, and I apologize for the poor quality of this Zoom here, but you can see the first page of this article with some photos of local people. And what he says is, today the races of Hawaii live together as one people, owning one common allegiance to their American nationality. Racial origin means nothing to the individual and his status as an American. Among the racial groups, there is mutual understanding and friendly sympathy. The spirit of old Hawaii governs, and race prejudice as such is not countenanced. Her people are building out of the varied constituents that make up Hawaii a capital N, capital H, new Hawaiian, proud of his Hawaiian nativity, of his ancestry, and above all, his citizenship in the great American democracy. Predictions of racial amalgamation functioned as a civic mythology of racial progress. And this is something that I've been working on for some time and has also been the subject of work by many other scholars. And in this rubric, Hawaii's ethnically diverse workforce, which was engineered by plantation owners to discourage labor organization and therefore intentional, not unintended, as Liddell Kelly had said in 1911, was imagined as a melting pot. But more than civic mythology, however, there was a concrete political goal here, and that goal was statehood. Romanzo Adams and others who subscribed to the coming neo-Hawaiian race paradigm were prominent advocates for statehood. They were expert witnesses during federal statehood hearings, and they were also public intellectuals who shaped perceptions in the territory and beyond about the appropriateness, naturalness, safety, and desirability of both American control of Hawaii and incorporating the colony as a state. And we could think of this line of argument as a kind of reverse of the arguments made in the early 1920s for immigration restriction to protect racial equality in the United States. And that was something that was a set of policies that was popular among legislators enamored with eugenics. Arguing with positivity for racial amalgamation in the Hawaiian Islands in support of statehood was the through line that I'm highlighting here. And I mentioned that we can just see for ourselves here that Samuel Wilder King has described his argument is that Hawaii has no race problem, which begs the question, doesn't Hawaii have a race problem? There's so many diverse people. We're talking about Jim Crow in the continental US and a kind of baseline white supremacy operating throughout the United States during this time. And the race problem, as it was understood by many social scientists and legislators, politicians, leaders, was that there would be a loyalty problem if Hawaii was made a state, given all of the people of different ancestries that lived there. And so what Wilder King and what others were arguing is that actually no, Hawaii is perfectly safe to incorporate Hawaii as a state because not only are folks Americanizing culturally, but there's a fusion going on such that we have a new people altogether. So I guess I'm going to conclude here and look forward to some discussion. Arguments about race mixing being a good thing were ways of continuing to interpret social problems like the supposed degeneration of Native Hawaiians or a diverse population of as yet unassimilated territorial residents as biological problems with biological solutions. And this is the kind of thinking that I'm arguing is continuous with a kind of eugenic thinking and is therefore one of the legacies of eugenics during this period.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was an incredible presentation. I specifically really liked how you brought up the idea of Hawaii as a melting pot. Even the idea of Hawaii as a melting pot, or even Hawaii as a multicultural paradise free of racism, is still an idea that's promoted, even within the University of Hawaii, where so many of us study and work. So thank you so much for bringing that into the conversation and connecting how we view Hawaii to the process of eugenics. The next speaker I'd like to bring up is J. Kehaulani Kauanui. If you're able to turn on your camera right now, that would be the perfect time. Mahalo. J. Kehaulani Kauanui is a professor of American Studies and affiliate faculty in anthropology at Wesleyan University, where she teaches courses related to critical Indigenous studies, critical race studies, settler colonial studies, and anarchist studies. Kauanui earned her BA in Women's Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and her PhD in History of Consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Kauanui is the author of Hawaiian Blood, Colonialism and the Politics of Sovereignty and Indigeneity, Duke University Press, 2008, Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty, Land, Sex, and the Colonial Politics of State Nationalism, Duke University Press, 2018, and Speaking of Indigenous Politics, Conversations with Activists, Scholars, and Tribal Leaders, University of Minnesota Press, 2018. Busy year, 2018. Her work is widely published in a range of academic journals and edited books. She also co-edits a book series with Jean M. O'Brien called Critical Indigeneities for the University of Carolina Press. Kauanui is one of the 6 co-founders of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, established in 2008, and she's the recipient of the Western History Association's 2022 American Indian History Lifetime Achievement Award. Professor Kauanui, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Helena Kako, greetings everyone, and mahalo to Ihilani for the introduction. And thanks to Benedict for organizing this event and inviting me to present. I just want to make sure people can hear me. Okay. In my brief time here, I want to explore, actually, let me back up and just read my title. Settler Colonial Fascism, Eugenics, and Indigenous Elimination in Hawaii. Today, in my brief time, I want to explore both the historical and contemporary connections between eugenics and settler colonialism in the context of Hawaii by addressing the rise of US fascism. This is not hyperbole. As Erica Keynes reminds us, quote, fascism is not a neat category of political ideology, but rather a historical reaction to recurrent threat of revolutionary decolonization and the chronic instability of a geopolitical system structured around capitalist empires, end quote. She explores fascism's historical relationship to liberal democracy, noting that in all of the colonial empires, settlers were provided with forms of democratic participation, while the empires simultaneously imposed fascism as colonial governance. I articulate that legacy to contemporary forms of settler colonialism. One can see the obvious connections to eugenics, that is, social engineering for a new population, a settler population figured as better and stronger and therefore capable of superseding the indigenous. As context for my discussion, I note that my first book, Hawaiian Blood, includes a critical account of early 20th century eugenics in relation to Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiians. The broader project presents a social and legal history of the 50% blood quantum rule that both the US federal and Hawaii state governments continue to use to define Native Hawaiian for the purpose of land leasing and other select programs. This criterion was first codified in US congressional legislation called the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1920. In the contentious federal committee debates that finally led to the act, politicians, along with attorneys and other representatives for the white plantation class, advanced a welfarist discourse of racial incompetence to criticize the so-called full-blood Hawaiian, arguing that only those who were unmixed needed access to land because, as the logic went, they were incapable of fending for themselves. They cited studies of racially mixed Hawaiians, like those Christine just discussed, drawing attention to European mixed Kanaka and Chinese mixed Kanaka in particular, by suggesting they were more intelligent and industrious, respectively. Indeed, there were numerous studies on racially mixed Kanaka Maoli during this era, so prevalent that one social scientist even crafted that new racial category, a composite designation he termed the Neo-Hawaiian American race, defined as the ultimate hybrid or mix of peoples of the world. In the end, white property rights in Hawaii prevailed within the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act as it reduced the designated territory for land leasing to match the high blood quantum rule, thus reducing the demographics of who would count as Native Hawaiian. Given the settler colonial context, the imposition of blood quantum policy entails the racialization of indigeneity that serves to undermine enduring indigenous presence on the land. Haunani K. Trask identified the hallmark of settler colonialism as, quote, the obliteration rather than the incorporation of indigenous peoples. Complementing her work, I also draw on what Patrick Wolfe theorized as the logic of elimination of the native, which he argued was the overriding feature of settler colonialism because land acquisition is the central goal. As Wolfe explained, because settler colonialism destroys to replace, it is, quote, inherently eliminatory but not invariably genocidal. That is to say, quote, elimination refers to more than the mass killing of indigenous peoples, though it includes that, end quote. Therefore, he suggested that structural genocide avoids the question of degree and enables an understanding of the relationship between mass killings, spatial removal, such as ethnic cleansing, and coercive forms of biocultural assimilation that render the native non-native. In my remaining time, I want to think through spatial removal and settler colonial replacement, turning to Maui as just one example from Hawaii for an immediate case study. As we can see in the aftermath of the wildfires, not so wild after all, there is a race to replace the remaining Kanaka Maoli on the island by pressuring those who own their land in the first place to sell it when they are the most desperate, namely without homeowners insurance to build or access to capital. Notably, like much of Maui County, the Hawaiian community in Lahaina was already a stark minority before the fires, at less than 10% out of nearly 13,000 residents, and struggled with affordable housing access and ongoing displacement. Understandably, there is fear now that Kanaka Maoli will be forever priced out of the islands, as Hawaii in general is already the most expensive state claimed as part of the USA. Many understandably speculate that both the fires and rebuilding process may intensify the ongoing outmigration of Kanaka as developers and private equity firms swarm for their slice. The fires on Maui have damaged or destroyed more than 3,000 structures and killed nearly 100 people. Yet all of this was preventable. As Naomi Klein and Kapua Ala Sproat have documented in answering the question, why was there no water to fight the fire on Maui? Big corporations, golf courses, and hotels have been taking water from Kanaka Maoli and other people, namely locals, for decades, following 19th century plantations that diverted water to the sugar and pineapple industries, displacing Kanaka Maoli while also hastening deforestation. And now those who have suffered immeasurably are having to organize against renewed forms of water and land theft. On August 19th, Hawaii Governor Josh Green signed an emergency proclamation prohibiting the making of any unsolicited offer to purchase or otherwise acquire land in the areas hit by the fires. However, while this may seem like an earnest effort to fend off predatory purchase offers that prey on those most pulverized by the devastation, we know from the ways in which the city, county, and state governments abandoned the people of Maui during their most crucial time of need that the stated aim of protection is a farce. Earlier, just 1 week after the fires started, the governor was already discussing state acquisition of those same lands, which remains to be seen but should be understood as part of the threat of ongoing settler colonial dispossession. And here I might also highlight that long prior to the fires, Maui City Council was implicated in this of ongoing removal of Kanaka Maoli families who were asserting their Kuleana rights. Earlier this year, Maui City Council invited me to present to them, to explain to them what settler colonialism is, because people on the land were accusing them of backing settler colonial elimination. And this is also, was coinciding with so-called hate crimes for land protectors who were, embattled with Haole who were buying land. Now, reckoning with that reality necessitates understanding the role of both tourism and gentrification. As reported in the media, according to the Hawaii Tourism Authority figures for 2019, long before the COVID-19 pandemic, tourism was the largest single source of private capital for Hawaii's economy, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs. Importantly, tourism itself hastens gentrification. And here I want to note that unlike how people often talk about in settler colonial contexts, that gentrification is like colonialism, it is not like colonialism. It stems from colonialism. It is a part of settler colonialism. And if you think of each property chain that furthers that reach for indigenous land back. But also, historically, the eugenics movement itself gave birth to gentrification. This is where the ideology of so-called improvement comes together with the elimination of the native. Hence, I want to highlight what is now being dubbed climate gentrification on Maui, hastened by disaster capitalism. Eugenics is not just physical reproduction emboldened by ideologies of supposedly improving specific sectors of the human species guided by white supremacist notions of race. It is also about a broader social engineering that involves space, territory, and relation to land. Again, as Wolf put it, settler colonialism destroys to replace. Consider that reality in relation to the great replacement theory promulgated by the alt-right. But none of this is a foregone conclusion. Settlers will always make a bid for permanence. That's how they do. Yet they have to contend with what I have theorized elsewhere as enduring indigeneity. And on Maui, Kanaka Maoli are insisting that the devastation from the wildfires presents an opening for Hawaiians to reclaim their land and economy, not just from tourism and developers, but also from the settler colonial state, all of which must be part of any anti-eugenics future. Mahalo.
Mahalo nui, kumukea kawanui for this really fantastic presentation and for reminding us, like you said, that gentrification is not like colonialism. It is an extension of colonialism, and eugenics gave birth to gentrification and the erasure of indigenous peoples from their lands. So mahalo nui again. Now I'd like to open up the floor for questions. Myself, as well as Benedict, will be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please put that in the chat right there. Anonymous attendee asked, what actions are needed to combat these eugenics? So any panelists can take the floor to address this question. Thank you so much.
I think in the context of Hawaii specifically for the moment, it would have to entail a rejection of any kind of logic of elimination of the native, and that includes blood quantum by turning to genealogy. It's genealogy that ties us to the Aina. And we heard that loud and clear from Kumu, Jonathan. And those are all part of it. And that is the basis for land back. And so to me, the interconnection of these racial ideologies that we also heard Rebecca and Christine outline, it has to do with not just rejecting those logics, but actually implementing something that actually addresses them in terms of restitution and repair. And that is the restoration of the ability to articulate those genealogies and our interconnections to each other and to our land base and to our waters, and also to reject any kind of narrative of dilution. And that is also about severing belonging. That's the core trauma of our peoplehood.
I want to add to that. I completely agree that redefining these arguments over identity from the kinds of racial constructs that Americans really have helped to invent and foist on the rest of us is really, really important. And reasserting our genealogical rights. But I want to take it further to talk a little bit about the whole Americanization project, because one of the things I didn't have time to talk about from Elima Long's MA thesis is her pointing out that the decision to extend an American education to Chinese, Japanese, Hawaiians, to Americanize them was not it was not some gentle wondrous gift. This was done because of the fears of the white minority in Hawaii, that they were going to be outnumbered as early as the 1920s by people who were entitled under American law to vote in the territorial elections, and that their only real hope was to get the masses, that polyglot population, to see themselves in close communion with American and American values. And the extent to which that exists today, I think, is one of the things that really prevents us from really securing justice in Hawaii, Native Hawaiians from seeking justice in Hawaii, is because we are continually messing with this idea that we are all in this together. We are a melting pot. We are related to each other. We don't want to dispossess anyone. But honestly, where do we get justice for the 1.8 million acres of land that were taken from the Queen and from our government? Where do we get justice for the removal of Hawaiians from political decision making, for the suppression of our language, over 75, 80, 90 years? How do we achieve that without saying, okay, first of all, maybe the problem is that all of us are buying too easily into this notion that American culture and American values and even American democracy is superior to the institutions that we come from. So that's for the 21st century, and especially given the kinds of things that we are seeing in the world, and the vicious fighting between people who are actually genealogically related to one another, perhaps. I think we have to answer the question about how we recover our own sense of ourselves culturally, through language, and certainly in our ability to govern ourselves and control over our lands.
I'm also really interested in how eugenics has both historically and contemporarily taken the form of helping, like helping Maui, right? Helping the Hawaiians homestead, helping the feeble-minded. And I think we have to be really focused on those narratives around helping, and who is helping, and how are they helping, and who is being helped, and be really critical of those, while not stopping helping, right? Like, we don't want to suddenly not care about one another, but also always having a critical lens for how eugenics can be sneaky and sort of hidden within a narrative of helping somebody or particularly marginalized communities, and just to keep that in our minds.
Yeah, I just want to quickly jump off of what Rebecca is saying and talk about one of the habits of mind and habits of governance that we see happening in the early 20th century that I think has to go is this framework of population management, or like managing people. This is a version of helping. A lot of the statistics in the photos on my slides are vital statistics, and the idea there was, we're going to manage all of these people and be happy that they're managing themselves into being a new race or whatever. But instead of people being constituents, or people who have a say about what happens to them, what happens to information about them.
Thank you so much. So we do have time for only one more question. I'm gonna read that off right now. And it's by Andrea Lowe. and it's a question that all panelists can answer. So currently, there's a lot of attention to the right of return home in Israel, for example. How do you see the exclusion of Hawaiian diasporic peoples outside of the US who mo'oko hau to Hawaii as a part of a eugenics project? Folks would like to address another question in relation to the two. Another question that we had from an anonymous attendee is, what is the view on holding conferences in Hawaii and potentially being complicit in the commercial exploitation of the island? And this is specifically related to what Professor Kawanui was talking about regarding land-related issues in Hawaii.
I want to answer maybe that first question by Andrea Lowe. I mean, so historical situations are not always comparable, and in our particular case, in the case of Hawaii, as opposed to Israel and Palestine, you know, which has a long history of settlement, migration out, and migration back. Our people have migrated all over the world, but this is still a Hawaiian homeland. This is still a place that was discovered by Polynesians, and where we dealt with multiple migrations from different peoples in the Pacific, and then later from Europe and from other places. We have actually created a society here. And that society was created not by the United States, but by the Hawaiian Kingdom, which welcomed participation in government to anyone who was willing to swear allegiance to the king, anyone who was willing to learn to speak either English or Hawaiian, anyone who paid their taxes and obeyed the laws. It's really difficult for Kanaka to talk about solutions in the present without addressing the fact that our kingdom government was illegally dissolved, and really with the help and the assistance and the intention of the United States. So answering questions like this, how do we get the people to come home? Restore our government, give us back our lands, admit that this is not an American place. And we'll have to handle it and muddle through, just like every other nation has to do those things.
I agree wholeheartedly. I want to just chime in with a couple other quick points. I mean, I understand the vast majority of the Hawaiian diaspora, not all of it, but tied to the structural process of elimination that's tied to settler colonialism. You know, understanding the structural forces that make it really difficult for people to stay at home and be able to actually maintain a family and a livelihood. So there's real, you know, for me, that's about for a different kind of expulsion, if you will. In terms of the right of return, I mean, I want to really highlight the Palestinian right of return. That's what, Palestinians have been asserting this, since the original Nakba. And we're seeing an ongoing Nakba right now. And I want to make sure to not gloss over that. I did wonder about the question when somebody said the exclusion of Hawaiian diasporic peoples. Hawaiians are one people, so there are the Hawaiian people and the Hawaiian diaspora. I guess the exclusion, it begs the question, in what context are the exclusions? What are we talking about? Excluding from the land itself or excluding from some kind of polity or organizing? The other thing I did want to follow up on just very briefly, somebody asked a question in the chat box specifically to me, asking about gentrification and climate gentrification and eugenics around this notion of the right kind of people around conservation politics. And I want to really bring to people's attention, if you're not tracking necessarily, is that with the resurgence of ecofascism as a branch of fascism that has resurged in the midst of climate crisis, and that is a sub-branch of fascism that blames climate crisis on overpopulation and immigration, and basically blames climate catastrophe on brown and black people instead of colonialism, right? The root of it. And some people have described that as greenwashing, white supremacy. The other thing, just as a bullet point, somebody else asked about holding conferences in Hawaii and complicity with commercial exploitation. I think that really depends on the context. For example, in the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, people apply to host conferences. So the next conference will be in Samiland in Norway, and a hub of people have organized and appealed to the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association to bring the conference there. That's what happened earlier with the conference for NISA that was held in Hawaii, which is really different than a lot of associations that basically just shop around the world and decide like a nice resort place that they want to go and tell everybody to meet them there. So it really does depend, I think, on the structural elements. It's all commercial. We can't get away from that. But I do think that when you're being, when people on the land are inviting or not makes a difference.
Sounds good. With that being said, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I'd like to bring back Benedict to the screen. Now we'll be transitioning over to our second session of the symposium, Eugenics, Disability, and Transitional Justice in the Pacific. So thank you, everyone. Take care.